We're now recording, and I'd like to welcome you to this year's Mike Stammers Memorial Lecture. My name, well, you can see it on the screen probably, is Nick White, and with Andy Davis, I'm co-director of the Centre for Port and Maritime History. CPMH, Centre for Port and Maritime History, is a partnership between the University of Liverpool, Andy's institution, my institution, Liverpool John Moores University, and also the Merseyside Maritime Museum. It's very nice actually just to see a message from Janet Dugdale saying that she's looking forward to seeing us next year, hopefully at an NML venue. So that's really nice. Thank you for that, Janet. And this annual event is to mark the huge contribution of our much loved, much missed and respected former colleague, Mike Stammers, and his contribution to port and maritime history. So welcome to you all. We've had an amazing response. That's really wonderful. I think we've got about 100 people registered, so that's really great. I also need to quickly thank our partners in this event before I go on to introduce our speaker tonight. Thank you to the Historic Society of Lancashire and Cheshire, National Museums Liverpool, the Liverpool Nautical Research Society, the National Waterways Museum, Ellesmere Port, the Royal Mersey Yacht Club, and also a special thanks to the Stammers family and especially Mike's brother David, who I think is in the audience tonight. So it is a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Roy Fenton to you, who will deliver today's lecture. Now, I think it's fair to say that Roy has had a lifelong passion for ships. And I recently learned that Roy's interest in ships began at a young age. Roy would go down to the jetty at Eastham Ferry with his friend, John Stokoe, and John is here in the audience. And they would watch the passing tankers, cargo liners, and steam coasters pass by on the Mersey, as well as the dredgers and weaver packets. And Roy tells me that 60 years on, this remains one of his favourite spots for ship watching. So I shall be getting down there soon. And it's perhaps unsurprising that this passion spurred Roy's research interests, which lie mainly in cargo carrying steamers and motor ships. And his work has established the importance of the East Coast coal trade, although we're going to hear about the West Coast today. The East Coast coal trade in opening up this sector to steam ships and beginning developments which resulted in the steam tramp and the modern bulk carrier. Roy is the author of many books I'm sure you're well aware of. I won't go through them all, but I'm particularly pleased, as we're on Merseyside, that one of his books, of course, is the Illustrated Fleet History of the Clan Line, which was so important to Liverpool and Merseyside. Roy is also, of course, a regular contributor to the Mariner's Mirror and the International Journal of Maritime History. And Roy is honorary treasurer, I should say, of the British Commission for Maritime History, and a director and trustee of the World Ship Society. And he edits, of course, edits publications in a regular journal for World Ship Society. So I'm going to hand over very soon to Roy, who's going to deliver this year's Mike Stammers Memorial Lecture entitled Salt, Stone and Steam, Making the Mersey a Major Coastal Shipping Hub. Now, Roy is going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A in which you should either type questions in the chat facility, or we were going to say put up your virtual hand, but we're not sure how to do that. So if you just raise your hand, and hopefully Andy or myself will keep a watch on that. So over to Roy. Thank you very much.
Right, well, thank you very much for that introduction, Nick. Very kind of you. I'm now going to do the bit that frightens me most in this presentation, which is click on share screen and hope that it's from beginning, please. Can you all see that? Introductory. Excellent. In that case, I'll take it as read to carry on. I was delighted to be asked to give the Mike Stammers lecture this year because of the help and encouragement I got from Mike when I put together this book, Mersey Rovers. I made sure that Mike got the very first copy after it was published in 1997. And Mike, being the polite guy he was, led me to believe that he found it quite useful in his role at the Merseyside Maritime Museum. As Nick pointed out, I was and probably still am a ship spotter. And this is where it all started with John Stokoe and others on the banks of the Manchester Ship Canal in Ellesmere Port. But as Nick said, my favourite spot is at Eastham Ferry. Though I didn't really appreciate it when I was just 14 years old. One of the reasons I continue going back to Eastham is, though there are fewer ships now, there were 2 decent pubs there, at least before the pandemic. I just hope they are still there. But sorry about this. I've already shown you 5 different ships, but I have to say this lecture is not about ships, or not just about ships. There are many more to come over the next 45 minutes, but I intend to talk what the ships were doing, and in particular, where they were doing it and the industries they served. It's a truism that shipping doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's entirely dependent on customers and the people it served. My aim is to explain how the Mersey became such an important river for coastal shipping. To give some idea of its importance, in the mid-19th century, 1/3 of all goods handled in Liverpool were shipped in coasters. So as the coasters tended to be a fraction of the size of ocean-going ships, they undoubtedly outnumbered the larger ships. And as I hope to show in this talk, Liverpool was only one of a number of Mersey ports which were handling coasters. Now, when I was at school on the Wirral, I was quite intrigued by local history, but the only bit I was ever taught about was Chester and its Romans. Now, Chester, they told me, was a very important port in Roman times. Okay, I asked, so why did Liverpool become so much more important? Well, I could go down to the Mersey at Birkenhead and possibly see ships like Cunard's Parthia, which was bringing passengers from New York. On the contrary, if I went down to the Chester River, all I might see was little tiny ships like the Indorita, possibly taking bricks from Connors Quay out to the Isle of Man. The answer I was given was that the River Dee silted up and the Mersey didn't. Well, even when I was 14, I thought that was an unsatisfactory answer, because I knew that Park Gate on the Dee remained an important packet station for Dublin into the 18th century. Surely the river couldn't just have dried up in 2 centuries. In fact, tinkering with the channel of the Dee, which began in the early 18th century, even before that, the Mersey had become a much more important commercial river. And to try and explain that, we need to look at a map. And this shows the Mersey Basin and the major waterways which fed into it. Just going clockwise, there was the Leeds and Liverpool, which for the sake of this story isn't one of the most important ones. Then there was a St Helens Canal taking coal from the St Helens coalfield in Lancashire. South of the river, the Bridgewater and the Trenton Mersey Canal. And particularly important, and I'll come back to it quite soon, is the River Weaver. Then down in the bottom, Ellesmere Port, a variety of canals came together to reach the Mersey at Ellesmere Port, and of course not forgetting the biggest one of them all, and very much a latecomer, the Manchester Ship Canal. Really, it was these waterways and the ports they served that. Sorry a second. That brought the trade to the Mersey from all around Lancashire, Yorkshire, Staffordshire, Manchester area, Cheshire and Shropshire, trade was feeding into the Mersey through these waterways and giving rise to small ports, or not so small ports in some cases, which served coastal shipping. I think historically, at least, the most important of these waterways was the River Weaver. The River Weaver flowed right through the salt-producing areas of Cheshire around Northwich, Nantwich and Middlewich. And once mining of rock salt began in the early 17th century, the salt industry needed cheap transport. And that, of course, meant water transport. And once the vessels that navigated the Weaver reached the Mersey, they could then carry on out, not just to Liverpool, but beyond that. So I think the salt area had its outlet to the Weaver. It could not actually manage an outlet to the Dee without a major canal construction. So I think the Weaver was of particular importance in the development of the Mersey. It was managed by the Weaver Navigation Trustees. Now, Hadfield in particular, the canal historian, was very keen on the Weaver Navigation Trustees. The trustees tried to keep charges reasonably low and as steady as possible while following a policy of continuous modernisation and improvement. It paid them. Just a couple of examples of the way they improved things. First was building the Western Canal to make a better route to the Mersey than the natural flow of the Weaver, which came out at Frodsham. The Western Canal was built to Runcorn. We'll come back to that again a bit later. This improvement continued right up into the 1930s. And a good quiz question is, which is the last town in Cheshire to become a seaport? The answer is Winsford. The navigation was extended to Winsford in as late as 1938. And I think the photograph here, little coaster coming through Northwich, that would have come from Winsford. Unfortunately, the Weaver flourished with the salt trade, but there was so much brine being pumped out of Cheshire that the proprietors decided to open their own pipeline to Runcorn, where various salt works were built. And in fact, I suspect this trade still goes on. This photograph I took in 1992, showing a coaster loading salt at Runcorn on the banks on the ship canal itself. However, the Weaver continued to prosper. Now chemicals were moving from the factories that passed to ICI, Winnington and Wolverscott, out to Liverpool, where the cargo was often transshipped to ocean-going ships for export, but also elsewhere. And there was a number of small coasters running down the Weaver. In fact, part of the problem, the little ship on the bottom left is called the Petit Falmer, a little Danish coaster, and the name Petit makes me think that, well, that was the problem the Weaver had. Ships like this were getting rarer, coasters were getting much bigger and really too big to get up the Weaver. So it was closed to commercial navigation sometime towards the end of the 20th century, though it's still open as a waterway, a pleasure waterway. But I think the Weaver was instrumental in helping the Mersey develop as a major commercial river. Now, there were salt works opened at Liverpool around the beginning of the 17th century, but the proprietors of the salt brine pumping and the salt mining in Cheshire wanted to do their own refining. And to do that, they needed coal. Now, they tried digging for it locally, but only came up with more salt. So they really turned to the Lancashire coalfield around St Helens. And the colliery proprietors were only too keen to serve them. And in fact, they got as far as building a canal. originally called the Sankey Brook navigation, but later on known as the St Helens Canal, which took served their coal field and came out initially further up the Mersey, but finally at Widnes. So at Widnes, we have another port, another canal port. These sequence of photographs are quite interesting. We've got in the top left, we've got a ship that arrived and had actually already navigated part of the upper Mersey to Widnes. It's putting its nose onto the bank of the river and enable it to turn around and reverse through the locks. And then it has to reverse into West Bank dock to berth. The bottom right-hand photograph, obviously quite posed, the crew of this Dutch coaster wouldn't normally wear uniform hats, but they've obviously dug a couple out for the photograph. The civilian in the foreground, who I was privileged to meet once, was Viv Thomas. He was the last man the upper Mersey navigation. And he explained the problem with the upper Mersey. Its channel moved, not just from year to year, but almost from month to month. And he reckoned he had to go out at least once a fortnight, even if he didn't have a ship coming in, to check where the channel was at the time. The difficulty, well, the cause of this shifting was because the Mersey itself rises up in the Pennines. The Weaver rises in the lower hills of Cheshire. And if you've got a difference in rainfall, if there was a heavy rainfall in the Pennines, the Mersey flow was stronger and that pushed the channel to one way. If there was more water coming down the river, the Weaver, that moved the channel as well and pushed it to a different direction. So this plan was prepared for the proposals for the Manchester Ship Canal, and really was making the point that the channel was very volatile, was a difficult one to use, which it indeed was. So this photograph tells a number of stories. We've got from the left a little, I think it's a German coaster. We've got a low air draft coaster in the middle that actually has brought a cargo from Paris. But inside of her is a sailing ship with a deck cargo of timber. And ahead of her is a little steam dredger built in the 1890s. This photograph was actually taken in July 1960, which is incredibly late to have cargoes delivered by sailing ship. And if you look in the background, you can see the reason for the demise of Widnes as a port. The current Runcorn-Widnes Bridge is rising in the background, and once that was built, local industry had a much better port available to it in Runcorn. This photograph was used on a bit of promotion for Widnes, which described it as a cheap port. Well, cheap it probably was. For a couple of grand in the 1960s, you could have bought the whole of West Bank Dock. It closed in 1970. And when I had a look in 1990, that was all that remained, just some of the entrance lock to the West Bank Dock. It's now been filled in, and I suspect, being Widnes, it's probably used for rugby union pitches. When I think of Widnes, I automatically link it with Runcorn. It's a bit like Morecambe and Wise, Runcorn and Widnes. Widnes actually had two ports, though you could probably make it three if you included the old quay facilities of the Mersey and Irwell navigation. Runcorn became a port because of two canals. The Bridgewater Canal, which reached it in 1773, and the Bridgewater Canal originated in Manchester, but was encouraged to finalise its cut to Runcorn when the Trent and Mersey Canal offered to join it and to have both canals to have a common entrance at Runcorn. It did very well, at least originally, because it gave a natural inlet for cargoes for the potteries around, and a lot of China clay was moving in, but it also connected with the West Midlands. The Trent and Mersey met up with the South and Worcester Canal and gave access to the industry around Birmingham, Wolverhampton in the Black Country. The first photograph taken in the 1890s, I think just after the ship canal opened, on the very left-hand side, you can see the funnel of a ship canal tug. The Bridgewater docks are doing quite well. There's a mixture of steamships and quite a large number still of coastal sailing ships, probably most of them bringing in China clay, maybe taking out pottery or bringing in iron ore or taking out cargoes of produced iron products. After this, Runcorn began to decline in importance, especially once the ship canal was open for business. The bottom photograph was taken in the 1930s and shows a ship rather laboriously unloading China clay. You can just about, I'm not sure you can see my pointer, but there's a little bucket here that's been taken out that was almost certainly filled laboriously by hand. So by the Second World War, Runcorn was really described as being almost moribund, but it wasn't dead yet. What tends to happen with the upper Mersey ports is that they wax and wane accordingly to how well Liverpool is doing. And in the 1960s, Liverpool was having problems with dock labour and management and had rather a bad press at the time. And Runcorn started doing very well. The reason for this was the opening of the Runcorn and Widnes, the Proffer Bridge rather than the old Transporter Bridge, which meant that Runcorn was almost a natural port for much of the industry of South Lancashire. And in shots like this, which is a publicity shot taken for the canal company who actually operated Runcorn docks, I can see, I reckon there's at least 8 or 9 coasters in there. The whole place looks very busy, especially again with China clay. Runcorn actually had 2 ports. The other was Western Point, in some ways a better set of docks than the Bridgewater docks. These were opened about 1810 when the Weaver navigation, progressive as ever, improved the bottom end of the Weaver by digging the Western Canal. And where it met the Mersey at Western Point, they opened docks, which were actually somewhat superior to the Bridgewater docks. This intriguing photograph, the steamer on the left is, I think, the Calcium of the United Alkali Company, a predecessor of ICI. And I was rather intrigued by all the mounds of white stuff on the quayside. Now, that is almost certainly not salt. You would not store salt in the open air, not at Runcorn. It would quickly turn back into brine. So I suspect the cargoes that have been carried are mainly China clay, again, destined for the potteries. So I suspect Runcorn, Western Point, took quite a lot of trade from the Bridgewater docks at Runcorn. Western Point also did quite well into the last part of the 20th century. I visited in 1971 and took photographs of a Polish coaster, an East German coaster, and a Greek-owned ship all working there. Since then, I'm afraid it's came to bad times, and I think it closed towards the end of the 20th century. And I suspect I believe there are plans to open it as some sort of lorry park or transshipment centre. Now we come to my home turf, Ellesmere Port. The canal map here explains its importance. Initially, it took its name from the Ellesmere Canal, which really was built to serve a number of limestone quarries in Wales. It flowed through Ellesmere, but much of its hinterland was really agricultural. But it did get a major fillip when a certain Mr. Telford, completed his Birmingham and Liverpool Junction Canal. This joined up with the part of the Ellesmere Canal, not far from Nantwich, and again, obviously that had its outlet through Ellesmere Port. That canal gave a fairly direct route between the West Midlands and the Mersey. It was one of the last canals to be built, or the last of the narrow canals to be built, and was built as very much a direct route, a straight line. Also, and it's important to note, the new cut going from the Chester Canal across to Middlewich, which actually gave access to the Trent and Mersey. So Ellesmere Port was not only handling trade from the Black Country, but also from the potteries. Wrong way. And that led to quite a complex of docks being built at Ellesmere Port. This is about their final extent in 1895, once the ship canal had built. And you can see from the various sheds the number of cargoes it was expecting. There's a clay store, there's a clay and general warehouse, there's a grain warehouse, and an iron shed. So it was doing quite a lot of trade. This photograph, the steam coaster, can be identified as the Lancashire, which was sold in 1916, and the flour mills in the background were built about up to about 1910. So this photograph is just before the First World War, but there's a large variety of craft in there, as well as the coaster. There's a narrowboat to the left, and the larger ships are a variety, larger vessels are a large, presumably a number of Mersey flats, or some of the wider canal boats that could get as far as Chester on the Shropshire Union. That's right, the Shropshire Union was the amalgamation of the two canals. Another photograph of the docks is interesting. It's got a railway wagon in the foreground, London and North Western Railway, and that's significant because the LNWR actually bought the Shropshire Union Canal. Initially, they were hoping to turn it into a railway, but they changed their mind and they actually developed the canal, which was a bit unusual for a railway company. They didn't like the competition, but they worked the Shropshire Union quite hard. And in fact, it was still carrying commercial traffic until after the Second World War, especially petroleum products moving up to Stanlow, to Shell's refinery at or from Shell's refinery at Stanlow. Of course, the saviour of Ellesmere Port as a port was the opening of the ship canal, and a very large, long wharf on the canal was opened, which, as far as I'm aware, is still working today. And it had a brief flowering as a container port. This was, again, at a time when Liverpool wasn't doing particularly well. Container service was open to the Iberian Peninsula by Ellerman Lines, and we also had container ro-ro ships coming in from the USSR. Eventually, Liverpool got its act together on this and decided that it would quite like this trade, undercut the Ellesmere Port, and the trade went along with the container cranes, which were actually, I'm pretty sure, moved to Liverpool. I mentioned in my introduction how Welsh stone contributed to the coastal trade of the Mersey. And there were really three varieties of stone moving. The first was slate, which was required as the Mersey area become more urbanized, a relatively cheap and very durable product for roofing houses. It came from mainly from two places, Porthmadog, and probably even more so from the twin slate ports on the Menai Straits, Port Dynorfig and Port Penrhyn. I've included this shot of one of the Dynorfig quarry steamers loading slate. I find this a very interesting shot, and thanks to the National Museum of Wales for it. You've got at least 12 guys on the quay, sliding slates down planks, and another 12 or even more, possibly receiving it in the hold and stowing it. slate is actually quite a delicate cargo in terms of moving it. It had to be stowed very carefully in the hold of a ship to avoid it moving in any sort of seaway. So loading it was a very slow process, and unloading it was equally slow. This helps to explain why sailing ships remained in the slate trade for a considerably time after they'd been displaced by steamships elsewhere. The advantage of a steamship, of course, was it could make more voyages in a given time than a sailing ship, and faster and more dependably. But if the ship like this had to spend quite a large proportion of its time in port loading or importing, the steamship lost its advantages in terms of speed, and you may as well load a cheaper, if somewhat slower, sailing ship. The second stone cargo was roadstone. Initially, this was made mainly of pebbles from various beaches, which was taken into the Mersey and used as for cobbled streets. Later on, the granite was actually crushed and used in Tar Macadam. Two places it came from. One was the coast of the Llan, the north coast of the Llan, and also around Penmaen Mawr. And this photograph, again from, I think, National Museum of Wales, illustrates why it was a good idea to have your quarries near the sea. The granite is being quarried high up and sent down on an inclined plane through to the little jetty. The guys who ran coasters, like the little Puffin, talked about going into a spindly little jetty and snatching a cargo before the weather changed, and so they could nip off quickly back to sea. Now, I can imagine doing that in a steamship or even a motor ship when you've got independent power, but I think it was a major feat of seamanship to do this in the sailing ship with neither of that and with no tugs available. Third stone quarry was limestone, needed partly as a flux for iron and steel making, and quite a lot of this went up to the Clyde, but it was also used by the chemical industry on the Mersey, and was shipped out from quarries in the Llandulus area. Company who were particularly interested in this was William Robertson, their gem line. This is their sapphire loading at the Penmaen Head quarry. William Robertson, to kind of make sure they kept the trade, actually bought some of the quarries around Llandulus. This is the Penmaen Head quarry. And if you can see in the background, you can see the North Wales main line running past. Quarrying at Penmaen Head had to stop when the quarry face got a bit too close to the tunnel of the North Wales Railway. But there were other quarries at Llandulus, which I think are still working and still exporting limestone by sea. At last, we're sort of getting nearer to Liverpool. Now, I know that Garston is technically part of Liverpool, but in terms of its docks and harbour installations, it was always completely independent of the Mersey Docks and Harbour Board and its successors. Indeed, it was competing rather successfully with Liverpool. I mentioned earlier the St Helens Canal. Well, the St Helens Canal got together with the railway company, becoming the St Helens Canal and Railway Company. They got a bit tired of the poor facilities at Widnes and decided to extend with a railway line to further downriver, and they chose Garston as their terminal. Unfortunately, the Mersey was no kinder to Garston than it was to Widnes, and with the channel shifting, they were in a bit of trouble. A saviour came along in terms of the London and North Western Railway, who were not very friendly to most people, but particularly unfriendly to Liverpool docks, and saw in Garston a great opportunity to compete with Liverpool in terms of moving coal from the St Helens coal field. And at one time, they were moving as much coal out from that field as Liverpool was doing from the coal fields around Wigan. This is taken from a fairly modern railway map, And you can see at the various, I hope I can point to these, the various docks at Garston had a great network of railway lines running to them. And at the end of each of those lines, there would be a coal tip. The coal would have come in, partly possibly from been stored at some of this network of sidings here and sent out from there. A lot of it was going to Ireland as domestic coal, but of course that trade declined along with the rest of the British coal industry. And since then, Garston has hung on, a few bulk cargoes come in, and at one time it did have a container service to Ireland, but the port is still open, and thanks to the investment of the LNWR, it needs continual dredging, which LNWR could afford. Right, we come to Liverpool. I've called it a reluctant host for coastal shipping, and this is based on a lot of what Adrian Jarvis had to say about Liverpool. He reckoned it was really rather unfriendly to the coastal trade. Its emphasis was on building bigger and better docks to accommodate the biggest ocean liners of the time, and they tended to treat the coastal trade with disdain. It was rather beneath their notice. So facilities for coasters tended to be the older and smaller docks with relatively poor actually handling facilities. However, Liverpool had naturally a large trade as it grew into our major port on the west coast. Redistribution of ships brought in redistribution of cargoes brought in by ocean-going ships was important. For instance, edible oils coming in from places like West Africa were shipped not very far, in fact, across the Mersey to Bromborough Dock in little vessels owned by Lever Brothers, some of which had rather nice names. They named after Lever Brothers products like Lifebuoy and Rinso. Grain was another major cargo that was redistributed coastwise, perhaps to the Carr's Mill up at Carlisle on little ships like the Eden. And later on, again in the end of the 20th century, various small, basically motorized barges were taking the incoming grain up the Mersey. Liverpool also gave rise to what I've tended to call the grocer ship owners. All these little ports in North and West Wales had at one time or another a regular steamer service from Liverpool. Now they were mainly concerned with general cargo, but I'm pretty sure if you ask nicely, you could probably ask for a berth on there if you're actually going home to see your parents and lived in Liverpool. A lot of these ships were actually owned by grocers. They were, I think, operating wholesale businesses in Liverpool, and they were using the ships to distribute the products out to little shops in North and Mid Wales. Liverpool had naturally important trade with Ireland, of course. A lot of this was in general cargo and some passengers as well, mainly in ships that were owned by various subsidiaries of coastlines, like the Ulster Star, the Belfast Steamship Company, the Munster, the British and Irish running to Dublin. There were plenty of stuff to ship out to Ireland, but less to bring in. One of its main cargoes were foodstuffs, especially livestock, and the ship to the top right of the Belfast, Mersey and Manchester Company would often call at the Lairage in Birkenhead to unload its cattle, a lot of which were then moved down by rail to Smithfield Market in London. And bottom right was a ship that was a very welcome sight to a lot of the Northwestern people. The Guinness, a lovely little steamer built in the 1930s and always immaculately kept. Aficionados of Guinness always told me that the Guinness in the Northwest was actually much preferable to that in London, because in the Northwest it was coming directly from St James's Gate Brewery in Dublin, whereas London was having to make do with stuff that was brewed at Park Royal and was never as good, they tell me. Coastal liner services. Another point that Adrian Jarvis made about Liverpool was that it was always very afraid of railway competition, especially the railways that connected it with Manchester. And if you recall, the reasons for building the Manchester Ship Canal were that the cotton coming into Manchester, a very high proportion of the cost was actually shipping it out of Liverpool into Manchester. So Liverpool really didn't like the railways very much. And Adrian makes the point that, well, why didn't they do more to encourage the coastal trade? These coastal liner trades were in direct competition with railways. And it is, I think, a tribute to the economy of coastal shipping that they managed to do this. Coastlines, for instance, had a regular Liverpool to London service, not just for general cargo, but also carried a number of passengers. Now, that was probably a nice trip in the summer if you had time. You were going quite a long way around. You were stopping at quite a few ports in Wales and on the south before you got to London. But coastlines could operate this service until the 1960s. I well remember the Pacific Coast on this service. The next one below is Fisher Rennick steamer, and that was running from Manchester to London. Now, if you think about it, Manchester is barely 200 miles from London by road or rail, yet this ship, which was probably steaming about 500 miles, was able to compete with the railways. The most extreme example is the ship on the right. I'm not sure if this ship actually was running between Liverpool and Hull, but my old prof, John Armstrong, wrote a paper about this, marveling that a company could run a coastal steamer service right round from Hull, right round the north of Scotland to Liverpool, when the two ports were barely 90 miles apart by rail. And these, in their heyday, these did show the economy possible with water transport. Liverpool was peculiar in one sense, in that you could sit on the banks of the Mersey and watch a ship going out fully laden with coal, being passed by one coming in that was fully laden with coal. The coal going out was probably loaded at the high-level coal railway in Bramley-Moore Dock. Again, turning to the rail map, the Lancashire and Yorkshire, it was this time, were encouraged to build a siding off their main route into the docks, and these served coal drops, like you can see on the left, coal stays rather, in Bramley-Moore Dock. You can tell from the foreground, quite a lot of this would be loaded into Mersey flats and probably taken either coastwise or up the Weaver to the salt works there. Some of it was supplied as bunker coal to steamers, but quite a lot of it was shipped out, for instance, to Ireland as domestic coal. So coal was coming in as well at the same time, but this was a rather different species of coal. This was steam coal from South Wales, brought in typically by ships like quite large colliers, like those owned by Rea, the Rea family. Now, I can remember Rea as being one of the major towage companies on the Mersey, but they also operated a big business in terms of bunkering ships. The attraction of steam coal to Liverpool ship owners, especially those with fast liners, was its low ash content. So there was less problem in getting rid of the ash from the furnace than, say, if they'd used the less good, in their terms, Lancashire coal. This trade sort of continued until after the Second World War. Various ships like the Kylebrook here were running steam coal from Cardiff to Clarence Dock Power Station on the docks. Right, we come now to the last of the waterways, the Manchester Ship Canal, completed right through to Manchester in 1895. And I'm really concentrating on the eastern end of the canal. As you can see, it passes quite a number of ports that existed before the ship canal came along: Ellesmere Port, Western Point, Runcorn, and could give access to Widnes as well if ships were prepared to lock out and cross the Mersey. Initially, it made quite an improvement to these ports. The ships did no longer have to go up the twisting channel of the Mersey. And in fact, as part of the concessions that the Ship Canal Company gave to these small ports, ships heading for the ports were allowed at favourable rates to use the ship canal. I think there were various caveats about states of the tide and things, but the ports did tend to do well because of it. One of Liverpool's objections to the ship canal, quite strident objections, was because they feared it would be taking some of their trade away. And certainly the ship canal did extract some traffic which could technically have gone from Liverpool or the other Mersey ports. For instance, China clay running up to Runcorn, and coal, which was being shipped out in large quantities from Partington coal basin, where it was brought in by rail, probably from Lancashire, but especially from the Staffordshire coalfields. The ship canal also hosted quite a bit of general cargo traffic, which is actually loading at Ellesmere Port on the quay there, was running a regular service to Belfast in the 1890s. Interestingly, you see just behind it, you can see, rare event, a full rig sailing ship on the ship canal. What is now, I think, some of the oil berths there. And on the right, a trade that was continuing again into the 1960s, British and Continental running a regular service to Antwerp, Rotterdam. However, the ship canal did generate quite a lot of new traffic for the Mersey. It provided a great length, about 35 miles, of deep water, which industry found quite attractive to colonize, especially the petrochemical industry. And I'm thinking mainly of Shell, who built what was their largest UK refinery, or once was their largest UK refinery, alongside it at Stanlow. Nowadays, the chemical and petrochemical industry really are the suppliers, are really the only coasters that now use the canal and probably make up the major part of the traffic into the Mersey itself. We've got refined products moving in and out of Stanlow, liquid petroleum gas. There was a facility at Ince for unloading this, various chemical products from petroleum like bitumen was moved in specialist ships, and there was even a service carrying chlorine from DuPont's works near Warrington to Belfast. Rather interesting little ship this. It had a air-conditioned wheelhouse that was actually sealed, so if there was a leak of chlorine gas, it didn't gas the crew. Now, beginning my summary, there were a large number of different cargoes moving in and moving out of the Mersey. I've mentioned a lot of these: salt, coal, China clay, iron ores and other ores, stone products from North Wales, general cargo, indeed groceries, grain moving in and out, chemicals and petrochemicals. So there was a large variety of trade moving into the Mersey. And I think it's fair to say that of all the estuaries of the UK, Liverpool probably had the biggest variety of coastal cargo. Obviously, London had a bigger trade, but that was dominated by coal coming in and general cargoes being distributed from London. Apart from a certain amount of cement, there weren't many other cargoes originating on the Thames. So Liverpool had, if not the largest coastal trade, at least the biggest variety of trades. I mentioned in my title the importance of steam, and the companies listed here are the people who owned steam coasters all based on the Mersey. And I've listed them in order of where they actually came from, because the Liverpool became very attractive to coaster owners for various reasons. One of the points was that the coastal trade into Liverpool was particularly well balanced. So you could take a coaster into Liverpool, unload there, and have a reasonable expectation that you might get a cargo out. Also, Liverpool became really much a centre in its own right of shipping. As a coaster owner, if you had your office there, you had other owners nearby you could gossip with and learn about trade. You had access to people like financial institutions, banks, insurers, repairers, surveyors, and even if you needed them, solicitors. So all these companies at one time or other moved their business to Liverpool. I've been rather cavalier in regards times in this talk. I've covered a period of approximately 270 years. So to concentrate on the chronology of the area, I reckon the first 100 years I've spoken about, from the beginning of the canal age to about 1850, was very much a growth phase, dominated completely by sailing ships. The first steam coasters arrived on the Mersey in the 1870s, really improving the shipment of cargoes in and out. And that really gave rise to what I would call the zenith of the Mersey's coastal shipping, which I reckon stretched from 1880 to the First World War. After the First World War, a decline set in, relatively slowly at first, despite improvement, including the introduction of motor coasters. Decline continued and probably accelerated after the Second World War, though in my days as a ship spotter on the banks of the canal in the 1960s, you still saw a fair number of coasters coming in and out. Probably from about 1980, the trade fell off a cliff. And we're left now with the surviving trade, as I mentioned, mainly chemicals and petrochemicals, a lot of it going in to the ship canal, though not a lot of trade going in there at the moment. So really, to summarise, what did make the Mersey a coastal shipping hub? Well, existing or potential industries in the area stimulated waterway development. This could bring in cargoes of coal, china clay, other things from Lancashire, from Yorkshire, from Staffordshire, from the West Midlands and Cheshire and Shropshire. Giving these people economical water transport, it encouraged the growth of these industries. And indeed, the availability of deep water, such as on the ship canal, attracted new industries. Ship owners responded with bigger and more economical craft, hence accelerating the trade. But we need to remember that a truism about any sort of shipping, coastal shipping really is a servant of industry. It doesn't exist on a vacuum. It exists because industry needs to ship material out. Consumers need the product that they receive from these industries. So all I have to do now is to say thank you very much for listening. I've got a long list of acknowledgements. Most of them don't know they actually helped with this thing. They either supplied photographs or wrote books and articles which I've drawn on for my talk. So I'll stop sharing there and hope that you've got some questions for me.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Roy. That was a marvellous talk, which marvellously illustrated, marvellously explained, which I think clearly shows the role of the wider Mersey Basin waterway system, but also the coast as well, coastal trade as well. And I was really surprised about how long this goes on, into the 60s and the 70s. And I must admit, I was absolutely fascinated to find out that there was a passenger service still between Liverpool and London as late as the 1960s. Incredible. Yeah. So great stuff. I won't hog it. I've got lots of questions myself, but Andy, have you got an idea of who we should go to first? Or
it looks like James has his hand up.
Right. Question from James.
James needs to unmute.
Yeah.
I don't do sign language.
Can you unmute, James?
I will try and unmute if I need to.
And then there's a question from Stuart Wood.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Andy. And a splendid talk, Roy. Thank you so much. I was waiting with bated breath, and I have to say I was disappointed, but we can fix that between us. There's no problem in that we still have operational a steam vessel, which was part of the Shropshire Union Railway and Canal Company, towing barges up and down the river. And my point is not a question, Roy. It's just to issue with due warning that you and I are going to talk fairly soon about how we might include the Daniel Adamson in your talk. Once again, congratulations for a smashing talk. Thank you so much. Treat to hear it. Thank you.
James, are you unmuted now?
Yeah,
great.
Yeah, thank
Go
you.
ahead.
Sorry, it took me time to find the right button. I was whizzing around the system.
I know the problem. I know the problem.
Roy, first of all, thank you very much. That was fascinating. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sure other people listening did. And before I retired a few years ago, I ran a company. It was actually a telephone helpline company, but we rented properties from the Mersey Docks and Harbour Board. And I remember being told by one of their key people that despite all of the sort of story that you've just laid out, they said there were more tons of cargo and a wider variety of cargo moving today, which was now about 5 or 6 years ago, than there ever had been before on the Mersey. It's hidden inside containers, so you can't see it, but that was what they said. I don't know, do you want to comment?
Quite likely. I mean, the thing is, most of that is ocean going trade, isn't it, rather than coastal trade. I mean, very much concentrating on the coastal trade. But I would have thought, in terms of varieties of cargo, okay, if you're counting very small items of general cargo, there are probably a lot. But in terms of the bulk cargoes, which made up with the essence of coastal shipping, I think the Mersey was moving a lot more historically than it does now. No, I don't think, what can I think of comes in now? Does stone come in by sea? Probably not. It is mainly chemicals and petrochemicals. But I would accept that Liverpool is probably taking a larger volume of cargo than it ever did, but in larger ships and in boxes as well.
Thank you.
I think Stuart had a point in relation to that. Is that correct?
Stuart, did you have a point?
Nick, if I might make a comment, I'm sorry to do this to you, Roy. I'm sure you're heartily sick of such people, but when I first went to school, and I'm not telling you when because it was a long time ago, the amount of tonnage through the port of Liverpool has never dropped back. As someone who worked in the port, on the river and so on for 50 years, the amount of cargo going through the port of Liverpool has always increased, never fallen back. The difficulty you have with cargo in Liverpool is describing what cargo they do not deal with. And until recently, it was passengers. But I think you will agree, to everybody's credit, they fixed that. So in terms of the type of cargo and the tonnage through, it continues to go upwards, which is marvelous to you. Once again, apologies for butting in. I really should take a lesson from you. Thank you very much.
I've really been concentrating, as it says on the tin, on the coastal trade. I think someone is asking to know about the Daniel Adamson. Stuart.
I imagine, Andy, that's probably the last request you would require this evening, having labelled this for my very good friend Mike Stammers' commemoration for, and Roy is cringing, I'm sure, and if he's not, he should be. But I'm one of the many volunteers with the Daniel Adamson. The easy trick to this, if I might suggest, is that we talk after this is finished and see whether we can bolt something together to make the information about the 1903 steamship, which is still going. It's still essentially as she was, and it belongs to everyone. I think it's a subject, it's a big subject, and it's something we should address ourselves, perhaps with your cooperation in the future. I look forward to that, and we hope to talk about it another time. So not dodging the issue, but it's perhaps you know, if you want 45 minutes, I can start now. Do you want it? No, you don't. Okay.
Need to get.
Edmund, I see you've got your hand up. Are you asking a question?
Unmute.
Thank you, Nick, for letting me know about this presentation. I thank you, Roy, for a very interesting presentation. Definitely a very, very busy history of coastal shipping there. I was actually asking earlier on the chat group the depth of the Manchester shipping canal. And I was wondering whether depth issues, dredging, harbor dredging issues were anything that was significant for such a large maritime traffic.
Well,
you know, you did mention about the river, the rainfall affecting channel depth. So was dredging an issue? Was a lot of dredging done to maintain the depth of the channels?
Well, if you think, I mean, I would make the point that the Mersey was excellently placed for shipping, but it had to be developed. A vast amount of work went on dredging the entrance channels to the Mersey and building retaining walls. And that was necessary and still is necessary right up to the limit of navigation at the moment, which is Eastham. In my day, when I sat at Eastham Ferry, there was nearly always a dredger working away very noisily, creating the channel, and it still goes on. Dredgers have got more powerful and more effective, but the channels still need to be dredged, basically.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Edmund. Nice to see you, Edmund, by the way.
Yeah.
So there was one question that Simon Hill sent to me during the chat privately. It was kind of a combination of a comment and a question, which I can jump in with. Where he was saying it was very interesting that you were mentioning the coastal trade in the 19th century, but like Nick, I suppose, I think Simon was interested in how far back that stretched rather than coming forward into the 60s. So he was saying he thinks coasters, Ireland and the Isle of Man accounted for something like 50% of trade in the 18th century. So I think he's kind of interested in how you think that kind of challenges the primary importance of the slave trade to Liverpool at that point, and those kind of narratives. I think.
I wouldn't be at all surprised if, it depends how you're measuring the trade, if you're measuring tonnage of cargoes or measuring number of ships. My interest is measuring numbers of ships, actually, and I think there were obviously more coasters involved than there were deep sea ships, but in total tonnage they were smaller. I don't know. I wouldn't like to get into a debate about Liverpool and the slave trade. I suspect it wasn't entirely dependent on the slave trade. I'm sure other port historians would like to discuss this matter, but I think Liverpool had a trade of its own. And I don't think the actual ending of the slave trade greatly affected Liverpool. Its merchants had already built up very good trades with, especially with North America and the West Indies and elsewhere. And the port just went on expanding.
Thanks, Roy. Just a couple of other comments, I think, as I'm working through. So Charles has commented that stone is still imported to Seaforth by big bulk carriers operated by yeomen.
Yeah, not from North Wales, though. It's from, what's it, Glen Sanders, isn't it? Yeah.
But David in the talk as well pointed out that Port Penrhyn in North Wales is still used for export of cargoes of crushed slate aggregate, which is now owned by Breeden Aggregates. Michael, you have your hand up. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I'll start again. I've forgotten I was muted. I'm a complete newbie to all of this, and I'm only here because I know Roy for other reasons. But I have a question that relates to the interesting list of goods coming in, if you can hear me, that he made. Salt, coal, China clay, many other things besides. This is not a slavery-related question, but it is a cotton-related question. And I was curious to know, in terms of coastal shipping, what goods might have come in internationally, as it were, into Liverpool, but then did not find their way onto coastal ships to be moved around the British Isles, as I might otherwise, as a complete ignoramus, have suspected would be the case. Can you comment on that?
Cotton, yes, cotton was heading for Lancashire. I think some of it would have gone in small craft up the various waterways, but mostly it was probably moved by rail.
Yeah, of course.
What other commodities coming in that weren't moved by coastal shipping? Sugar is got to be one as well. I suspect that was moved by land transport mainly. It depended on the size of the cargoes. If you were a big enough industry that, say, needed a whole shipload of grain, it was much more economical to move it by coastal traffic. If all you needed was a truckload, say, well, it would go by, probably best going by rail and later on by lorry.
So this is the rail sea waterways competition.
Yeah, very, very strong.
Thanks. Thanks very much.
And yeah, I can see Sherilyn has commented Liverpool surviving 1807, so the abolition of slave trade very well, despite political rhetoric in defence of the trade. And ships to the West Indies outstripped easily by trade to the northern colonies and states at that point. And I suppose as well, we can think about 1833 and the investment, the money that was given to Liverpool merchants invested in the slave trade that was then invested in things like canal development and things like that, and the whole industrial process, I suppose. And yeah, I'm sure Sherilyn could say a lot more about some of those kind of really interesting trading connections there, but I won't put her on the spot. Just trying to see, was there another question?
Sally has just posted a question, Andy. Sorry, it's disappeared from me.
I think there's a comparison with Hull.
Yes,
what the main difference is with Hull. Liverpool, of course, was facing the Atlantic. I mean, the Hull had Atlantic trade as well, especially in immigrants. But Liverpool, I suppose, well, definitely became the major British port for the transatlantic trade. And that brought in a whole lot of goods, it wasn't exclusively Liverpool, but things like grain, cotton especially, were very important to Liverpool. They were important to Hull, but not in the same extent. I mean, I think Hull was rated as about the 4th biggest British port after London, Liverpool and Manchester. Manchester in its heyday was the 3rd, and I think Hull was the 4th. Again, of course, Hull was very important in terms of fishing industry and a number of other things. It was exporting coal in quite large quantities from the Yorkshire coal field. And it had a quite important general cargo trade, because Hull and other ports on the Humber were the natural outlet from West Yorkshire, big towns of West Yorkshire, Leeds, Bradford, and so on. So it did have quite a considerable general cargo trade, both in and out. And of course, it was taking in wool from transship from London. Ships from Australia tended to unload their wool in London, and it was shipped by coaster up to Hull in considerable quantities. Great thing about that was you could take wool up to Hull and bring a cargo of coal back, but only after you'd cleaned the hold carefully.
Okay. We can't see any other questions. So I think on that, it leaves me to just say thank you so much, Roy, for an absolutely fascinating talk. And I think the fact that you generated so much interest in both the chat and also the questions here does show that you've really, drawn attention to, if I dare say, a sort of missing dimension to Liverpool's maritime history, port history, which I think is rather.
That was one of the great things about researching it, actually. I mean, I say at school, I was rather denied local history, but I really only started researching my book after I'd moved away from Liverpool. I found it a fascinating quest to find out more about the area. And even Ellesmere Port had a very considerable history, I discovered.
Yeah. No, as I said, I think there's linkages between the Mersey and those other river and waterway systems. Clearly, extremely important, and it's another factor in Liverpool's success, in inverted commas. So, yeah, thank you very much indeed. I should just say a particular thanks in terms of the organisation and running of this event so smoothly to my colleague in crime, Andy Davis, who has done marvellously in setting this all up and managing it wonderfully. So thank you very much indeed. And thank you so much for what's been a marvellous attendance and for your questions and comments. So we will keep you in the loop as far as we can about next year's event and also other Centre for Port and Maritime History events. And hopefully, if we are back to normal, if there's ever a return to normal, next year we will have a talk by David Jenkins, which will be a lovely link actually to what Roy has been talking about today, because he's going to talk about the connections between Liverpool and North Wales. So we will hear more about those coastal connections, which Roy has so brilliantly given us today. So I think a round of applause for Roy, and I see Steve New is holding up a picture of a coastal vessel, perhaps. Anyway, but thank you very much, Roy.
You're welcome. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Okay.
Cheers. Thank you, Roy.
That was Port Penrhyn, where my wife worked and lived, and that's a picture on one of our walls. And I nearly moved there as well.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Steve. Nice ending.